And welcome once again to EWTN's Bookmark. I'm Doug Keck, your host. Our guest author is Dr. Anthony Rizzi, author of A Kid's Guide to Physics and Beyond, and it's published by the Institute for Advanced Physics. Great to have you here, Doctor.
Good to be here.
It's great to have you here. You were on a few months back, back before Christmas. You were on with Father Mitch Pacwa on the live show.
That's right.
We had the opportunity to talk a little bit about this book and your work, and also Kids' Introduction to Physics and Beyond. Now, a lot of people would also know you've been on the EWTN several times over the years. Way back when you were actually on what, the Journey Home First?
Journey Home First, yeah.
Okay, and then
many times. Actually.
And then you actually did a series with Marcus, was the Science Before Science, a guide to thinking and believing.
Yes.
Which was based on your book, right? Basically.
The Science Before Science.
Science Before Science.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, for yourself, now you've got a Kid's Introduction to Physics and Beyond. Is it because you know, physics scares people, you know? I mean, you hear the name physics, you know. Phys ed was one thing, and when in Leave It to Beaver, they always said civics, and I thought that was a tough course. I found out it wasn't really that tough. It was just learning about the government, which we don't do anymore either.
It's tough for people
But do people learn much about physics in school anymore?
No, I mean, actually, there's a push called Physics First that's starting to push that, but still people tend to avoid it, and it's a problem. I mean, that is really the problem that is feeding our culture. Is only a top-level elite really understand physics, and it should be open to everyone.
Right.
And it's actually the first thing you know is the physical world.
Right, and that's why you don't want to scare people sitting here today saying, oh, this is a book about physics,
right.
Or, gee, Mom and Dad, thanks for Christmas. I got the Kids' Introduction to Physics.
Gee.
Was I really that bad this year?
That's right. That's not the way to look at it.
That's not the way to look at it,
Because there's not,
right?
you know, it's not an overwhelming thing. It's a simple thing. It's very simple things, and it orders your universe. It's not, don't expect to open this book and find all kinds of equations that'll blow you away.
Right. Yeah, you have very few equations, and they're near the back.
There's one.
Right,
There's
okay,
one, and it's very simple.
Right,
it's
okay.
a very, multiply this times 2 times 1 equals 2.
Right,
That's
right.
the most complicated thing in the book as far as math.
Well, you say here, Kids' Introduction to Physics is an essential supplement to every child's science textbooks, giving the big picture of what physics is and its foundational place in our understanding. You say especially for kids, but parents can use it. Now, kids as young as 6th grade. Obviously, in reading this book, I realized my science ended around 5th grade because obviously I was still learning as I read this book. But the thing I thought was interesting with this is that you really say this book starts with common sense and assesses simple experiences common everyone. That really what you're saying in this book is, you know more than you think you do about physics. It's just you don't identify them related to physics, right?
Right. You don't think of them as physics because our culture has sort of excluded common sense as something. It's what.
So you put physics and common sense together in the same sentence. Why?
That's right. Exactly right. Because the common sense that the horse sense that people have used to talk about and still talk about comes from just being in nature, doing things in nature, and we've become so distant from nature that we don't think that way anymore. You know, we have football players who have girlfriends that don't exist, you know, because they they have internet relationships rather than real relationships.
An embarrassment to the University of Notre Dame at the time, as I recall. Yes.
Yeah.
Right.
And this is because we've lost this contact with nature. Right. We are so surrounded by artifacts, and the way we think is in this other kind of physics that's so hard, and so we leave the physics, we leave the common sense, we leave the thinking, in fact, to an elite.
And you say this book is a remedy for children. It gives these basics and many things that have never been published at this level before. Is there a reason why it hasn't been done, and what drove you to decide to do it? Maybe because it hasn't been done.
It hasn't been done, and what drove me is we've been working on the problem of our culture started in the 1600s, which I describe in this book, The Scientific Revolution, in which you had this new method, which I describe really for the first time at this level what it is. And that's
what everybody kind of learned, the scientific method.
The scientific, they heard that word, but they never learned what it meant.
Okay.
And so that's transformed our culture, and it's left, as I just described, only the elites knowing physics. And so we've spent the last 10 years at the Institute figuring out what those equations and things mean in terms of ordinary understanding, which had never been done before. And that's why the book now, because we had to understand it before we could write it.
Well, the part I was wondering, you kind of talk about in that chapter where you talk about that, the idea that kind of like, here we have the scientific method for the last 400 years plus. And so we're learning all these, and it's happening very, very quickly, but in some ways we understand less. How does that happen?
It happens because the scientific method allows you to encapsulate things in an equation and you have rules for manipulating the equations and get you answers that you don't quite know how all that happened, because the rules do the work for you.
Like using a calculator rather than sitting out and doing the math yourself or something like that.
Or like using a computer. People use a computer, they don't really know what's happening inside there, and they get an answer. They're happy with the answer they run, and they don't pay attention to what's inside. And that's what scientists have done over the years, is we've been able to, because it's a crutch that you can use, and you can use powerfully, and it's very good and important method. It's a needed method, but it can be misused in this way. And so you end up being able to get answers and results without quite knowing what you're doing.
How you got there.
How you got there and what it means.
Right. What it means.
What it even means.
Well, you say it's a little like spring cleaning of the mind. What do you mean? Why would a child need his mind spring cleaned?
Yeah, it's a very good point. A very good question. The mind that we have now is all confused, because this common sense that naturally would be budding in us is confused by our parents and teachers, not because of ill intent, just because they don't understand this material either. So I say this book is not just first for children, but first for their parents.
Yeah, you ever talking, there's really an interrelation in the sense of the children experiencing the book and you being involved with it and kind of helping them as they progress through it.
And that way you're learning it, and you're learning it with the child.
And reinforcing for them as well the important points that, because it's all building, as you say.
It's building from one chapter to the next. But by doing that, you're doing a spring cleaning, because you have all these things, like you said, you know this, but you don't really know it because you haven't organized it, you haven't seen it clearly the way other subjects have been given to you. This first subject has not. So you have to reorganize your mind so that the common sense you have can be made rigorous, and you can prove to people why such and such that you can kind of smell is right. You can prove to them that it's right.
Right. Well, this show isn't Bill Nye the Science Guy. This is EWTN Bookmark. So we usually somehow this connects to our faith and to God. And you say, remember, because we're made for truth, learning is enjoyable in itself, and we can help our children access this intrinsic enjoyability. Now, when we talk about truth here, we're talking about God.
We're talking about first truth with a small t.
Okay.
Because you learn truth with a small t. As a child, you learn this is yellow, Johnny. This is square, Johnny. You don't learn God. You don't learn soul. That's the fault of this. That's the so-called Cartesian idea that you would start with God and the soul. You start with simple physical things. And that's why we start that way. But once you know what a physical thing is, and I give the definition of a physical thing, which people don't know, again, in a clear way, in a definable, understandable way. Once you understand what a physical thing is, then I show in the book that you can prove that you either have to reject this base and become totally irrational, or you have to admit the one true God, who is our end. So the small t's lead you to the big T. And that big T shows you that's where you're oriented, that's what your end is. And it's not till you've walked through this that you really see that we know this. This is,
if it's so knowable and so obvious, why are there so many smart people just like you out there who believe totally differently?
That's exactly the point, is that we all have lost this base, and we lost it because we've done this equational jump. We use our computers rather than thinking through what the things are once we've gotten the answer. It's fine to use a computer, but at some point, somebody at least has to go back and see what it all means. And because we haven't done that, we try to bootstrap our responses, and we end up not being able to ground our responses. We end up saying what we want rather than proving what we're saying. So what ends up happening in culture is you decide what you want, you sort of pick a faith at random, and then you use reason to defend it. Instead of what should be the other way around, is you start with the ground, you prove certain things, and then you say this is true because, and then you proceed from there. And then once you know that there's a God, then the rational thing is to say, well, look, I can see that this is a loving God. After all, he's holding everything. I proved that he's holding everything in existence. He's directing everything. What could be more loving than that, to be the center of my existence? He must have said something. Then you go and look for, because on the way you've had to look for authorities like this book to learn that much to help you along that way. You realize there must be some authority that's going to help you with what comes after, which makes you ask the question that the church has the answer to, is where is that authority?
The unchangeable changer.
The unchangeable changer is now the one that's revealed himself in the Catholic Church.
Now you say in this book it's all about understanding, as we said, rather than memorization, but you say even memorization becomes easier when you understand. You really remember what you understand. Which is easier to remember, a rhyme with a powerful meaning or a list of all words from the rhyme written in random order? Now one of the things you started this thing off talking about sort of rhymes was from John Denver, Singing Skies and Dancing Waters. Why did you decide to start the book off with that?
Well, because I think that it's very important to remember we're physical beings, and music is a very important part of how we assimilate things. And when you put something to music, you're really strongly bringing in the full bodily nature of man, which responds to music. And music, and John Denver does a beautiful job capturing the essence of this book, which is that if you ever forget and you ever think that God isn't there, just look. And that's what the song is about. And it brings us back to that music is supposed to be enhancing our understanding of truth. And many of us have listened to music just for random reasons instead of enhancing our ability to get to truth. So if we can get people to sit down and listen to that song, we're changing their expectations, and we're teaching them that music actually builds you. And it can build your understanding. It's not disconnected from your understanding. Most music nowadays has no connection to understanding. It's trying to keep your understanding off because it's trying to salve your angst. And if you start the person thinking, then he gets more angst-filled because he doesn't have these truths that he needs. And he's trying to protect himself from it because he thinks there's no answer. So that music like that can start your mind going in a powerful, visceral way.
Is that also because music is mathematical?
Well,
effectively in a lot of ways, and so it connects to the sciences that way?
It connects to the sciences because it has this order, and you could call it mathematical. As I point out in the book, that there's substances, things that have their own existence, and then properties, things that exist in them. So like you have a blue shirt, I don't say, Doug, you have a blue, you have a blue something, because properties have to exist in a substance. So I have to have those things together, and I see that there's different types of properties. One of those properties is quantity, extension. And that's, every physical thing has extension at its base, math at its base. Math, again, another thing that people don't know, they study math, but what is it? It's that equation stuff. Well, am I just studying symbols in my mind? No, math is the study of that first property. And music, like everything else, has that first property robustly in it. And so it has that mathematical order. But the music taps it in a deep way because it's not just math. Like all physical things, they're not just quantity, they're also all the other properties. And that reveal the substance.
Well, you mentioned properties. Chapter 4, 9 types of properties. There are 9 different types or categories of properties you talk about. We have called both of these ways of belonging to things properties, but a better word is accidents. Now, there's one that jumped out at me because that's the kind of one that, as you start to get into your faith, and if you're a person who hasn't had a lot of philosophy like myself or something, who kind of learned as a tapeworm, listening to tapes and watching EWTN, suddenly one day you're sitting there with this discussion of transubstantiation and the word accident shows up and you're trying to think, so it wasn't an accident that this happened, so what did they mean by accident? And you talk about what that means here, right?
Yeah. I talk about that an accident basically means something that exists in another in 2 ways. It can either be a property, that's something properly that comes out of you, like my right arm is a property of me. My substance necessarily produces that. If I'm going to be fully me, I've got to have a right arm. But there's other things that I can have that I don't have to have, that are mere accidents. Like I can have a tan, or I can have this temperature, a slightly lower temperature, and I'll still be me, and I'll still be a complete me. So that distinction is really important, but the main thing is that there are things that exist in another, and that's really important for understanding the Eucharist. And until you've started with this beginning, you can't come to that advanced point, because when Christ and his church try to explain something, it's always going to be through the physical.
Right.
And the sacraments, of course, for that reason, are physical.
And that's why you would hear sometimes from people from like Alice von Hildebrand and other people who had concerns that philosophy, to some degree, was being downplayed many times in the seminaries in the 60s and 70s, and the result of that was not having the background to have the true understanding, right?
Right, exactly. And this is the thing that's been lost culturally, is the physics is the first of that philosophy. People have forgotten that physics is a part of philosophy. Philosophy, I like to give a simple equation. Science equals philosophy. to make philosophy a separate department is to make reality a separate department. And what is the rest then? The rest is nothing.
Well, this struck me too. Chapter 5, a thing cannot be and not be at the same time and in the same way. And you talk about the principle of non-contradiction. Now, we've heard that, again, sometimes in discussions talking about things that sound theological. That comes in as well.
Yes, yes. Whenever you're talking about anything, that's going to come in but the question is, where do you get that from? You get it, hey, this is brown, this is whatever it is, and it isn't what it isn't. And you see that immediately through your senses. And from that, you develop all the other things you're going to say. And if you're going to try to say faith-based things, you're going to use that. You're not going to want to say Christ is not and is something. You want to say he is this and not that and have them be different things. And you have to be able to say that, otherwise it makes no sense. And you're not giving a proposition that can be assented to, you're giving nonsense.
Now on page 24 you say, and this goes back to when you were talking about the scientific method, because you talk about Aristotle and it's lost, and Thomas Aquinas planted a seed, big physics, which is what you're talking about here, and the scientific method. You said, however, as with anything that is very powerful, it can be dangerous if not used correctly. I thought that was an interesting example. A circular saw can cut quickly through a thick, long piece of wood, but it can also cut through your arm. The modern scientific method is good and powerful for grinding out answers, but we just don't want the answers. Well, if we don't want what do we want then? Don't we want answers?
We want the answers, but we want an understanding of the answers. That's the distinction. We don't just want a pragmatic solution. We're made for truth. We're human beings, not human doings, as it once was said.
Okay.
We're made for becoming more of complete what we already are. God has a specific plan to perfect us, to make us more what we are, and that is in our growing and understanding through our life.
Is that also why today many times in society when issues like abortion and things come up, people have the answer? And then when you challenge them on a specific thing about it, they tilt.
Yeah, that's right.
Because they really haven't thought about their answer.
That's
they
right.
just said, well, this is my answer.
That's right, because what they've done is they've said, this is what I think is convenient for me, and then you defend that with logic instead of the other way around. What is the best thing for me? What is really in thinking? And you find that on the pro-life side too, that you probe to scratch too much deep beneath the surface, and they're trying to appropriately stop the killing, but they haven't understood themselves what the issues at play are, and so they end up sometimes being, hurting their own cause.
Right, or misspeaking in such a way that allows someone to make a point to say.
Yeah, to make a point and misunderstand. And the point is that the whole arc of a human condition is towards truth. So that if we try to put something instead, we're killing where we're going. Whatever we do should be toward increasing in the truth, not somehow getting a fast answer.
Now, in chapter 7, you talk about the most important kind of change, impetus. I got those two. Something called plana, which I have never heard of until I actually looked in this book. What is plana?
Yeah, actually I call it plana.
Plana.
It's actually very important because we use the word vacuum or space, and constantly we act as if vacuum is nothing. Well, what are we talking about if we're talking about nothing? Why do we have long conversations? I knew a guy that was actually a vacuum engineer, and he used to say, I'm an expert in nothing. When you think about that, he spent his whole life, career on nothing. That's not really what happened. There's something there. So the word plana is a Latin derivative word that Father Ashley and I came up with together, Father Benedict Ashley, which is a feminine of the word field, because the chief property of the vacuum, which isn't nothing, because vacuum indicates nothing, is the plana. So if I pulled all the air out, I wouldn't have nothing. If I put a bell jar and pulled all the air out, and there would not be nothing, because if it was nothing, the walls would come together.
Right.
So this is plana, and plana's chief property is the ability to have fields. And fields are just a certain quality, like light, that the field can have. That the plana can have, a property. So this is to emphasize that this is not nothing. But it's not the old view of what some people used to think. Aristotle had a kind of wrong understanding of he knew it wasn't nothing, so in that sense he was much better than people that think it's nothing. But he didn't understand the modern scientific revelations that we've had. So this is a word that captures that and tells you that it is a substance. It's not nothing, and it has properties. And the chief property it has is its ability to have fields.
Okay. Now, you also, talking about fields, I remember Fields of Dream, you say there's some particular thing in here that's important for ball players to know. You know what it is? When they're throwing baseballs and things like that.
It's about impetus.
Right, okay.
that when you give a ball, when you move a ball, you don't actually directly move the ball. You give it impetus that keeps the ball moving. And it's that power that you've given to the ball, that new property, that keeps the ball moving. And ball players need to understand that. I remember one time being at a museum that they had where you could fly the space shuttle. And I remember everyone else lining up, crashing the space shuttle. And I got up there and did it the first time. And it wasn't, I'm pretty good with hand to eye, but it wasn't because I was so great.
A lot of video game playing?
No, it wasn't even that. But you know, the point is that I understood impetus. See, what they were doing is they were thinking that immediately that you were directly moving things, so they would try to, when they needed to move it, they would try to give it more, and that would give it more impetus, and then they would have to take that impetus away before they'd stop it, and it was too late before they could get it to stop. And I understood that. So in the same, ball players understanding that will give, you know, now sports have a lot of modern physics in them. This will give you a way to do it in a very simple way that will keep, you know, that is understood rather than, you know, just done.
Now you say the powerful ability of math to reveal the other properties extends only very weakly to the sciences of man and his activities. This explains why the so-called soft sciences such as sociology, psychology are somewhat unstable, cannot be trusted anywhere near the same way as the hard sciences, and certainly we see that from what's going on in our culture. But also what's bad to some degree is because people see that and see the hard sciences as hard, when the science comes out about something, people think, well, that's what it must be.
Yeah.
But it changes all the time, doesn't it? I mean, it doesn't change ultimately, but our understanding of it changes, right?
Well, that's the funny thing is it really doesn't. The hard sciences really don't change. Newtonian physics, which is the first modern science, is still taught as the first subject. And there's a progression. And if you don't get Newtonian physics as a freshman, you're going to flunk the rest of your physics, because science builds. The hard sciences build. The soft sciences, because they can't use the math the way they are, and because they're much more dependent on understanding this stuff, which they don't, they make all kinds of errors, and the soft sciences do switch. You know, psychology switches from Freudian to Jungian to this to that every 5 years about, and there is no continuity. And that's because of this fact. And once you understand the scientific method, you can understand where it's most, and not that it doesn't have a use in those sciences, but it takes a lot more understanding. Whereas in physics, because you're so close to the mathematical, to that first property, it can maintain a lot more error, and there's a lot more positive feedback on your
Would that
mistakes.
be the same for, even though they're related, chemistry or biology and those things as well?
Yes, chemistry, I mean, the more you proceed away from the hard physics and math, the weaker it gets, but it's also true in its own way in chemistry and biology, especially as they're becoming increasingly under the control of the physics.
Right. Now, later in the book, this I thought was interesting. How many gods are there? Well, let's say there were two. Now, by saying there are two, we're saying that one is different from the other in some way. This means one has have something the other does not. This will mean one is not existence itself, but his existence is limited in some way. Thus, the second one is not God. Hence, there is and can only be one God.
Right. That's right. That's a very important point, because these things are not, as St. Thomas has already said, they're not matters of faith, they're matters of reason, that you can know that there's one true God. And you know, it's often said by people that don't understand, because they don't understand this material, that there's this tension between the God of the Bible and the God of philosophy. Well, that's really radically stupid in this primal sense of not knowing this material, because, you know, when I read the Bible saying a tree, I don't say, well, is the tree of the Bible the same as the tree over there? Why? Because I got the meaning of tree from over there, and the Bible is using that. When the Bible is talking about God, it's using the innate knowledge you have, not innate in the sense of born, but that you've grown up and you've figured out that God is there in a confused way. You haven't done it in a scientific way like you should in our culture, but you have done it to some extent. And Paul does it explicitly when he's talking in Athens, that, you know, you've seen the invisible God through the visible world around you. They're pointing to that God that you've figured out. That's why the Bible can use the word and say the things that it says, in the same way you can use a tree, because the tree is previously known.
Which is why it's important for us to understand the Trinity in its proper form. In the sense of dealing with, it's not three gods in the sense, you know, of competing gods.
That's right. It's one God.
Yeah,
It's the one God. Right.
right.
And this would preserve you from that. But the point is that you know this material in a confused fashion. At least you used to be able to know it in a confused fashion. Now it's so confused that a lot of people, as you pointed out earlier, a lot of people don't know it.
Right.
A lot of Catholics don't know it. And so the Bible, when it says it, you're open to, that's why you can have these theologians and biblical scholars say that stuff, because they themselves are showing by that. You know, if they said the tree is not the tree of the Bible, how do we connect the tree of the Bible? Then you know that they never seen a tree.
Right. Now,
in the same way you know that they haven't seen this.
Now, one of the things you talk about in this book is time, and we are out of it. I'm sorry. It's great to have you here. Thank you again so much, Dr. Rizzi.
Thank you. Good
Talking to Dr. Anthony Rizzi about A Kid's Introduction to Physics and Beyond, and it's available through the EWTN Religious Catalog published by the Institute for Advanced Physics. Join us next time right here on EWTN's Bookmark.